If you also click the first link, you can get the show notes, and the show notes impossible or necessary to get today, because there's a lot of data out there about the economic news and how impossible it is for Republicans, I think, to get a fair hearing in the press when it comes to this. Here's the headline. This is from CNBC. Layoff announcements soar to the highest since 2020 as DOGE slashes federal staff. President Donald Trump's efforts to pare down the federal government workforce left a mark on the labor market in February, with announced job cuts at their highest level in nearly 5 years. Outplacement firm Challenger Gray and Christmas reported Thursday. The firm reported that U.S. employers announced 172,017 layoffs for the month, up 245% from January, and the highest monthly count since July 2020 during the heightened uncertainty from the COVID pandemic. In addition, it marked the highest total for the month of February since 2009 during the global financial crisis. More than 1/3 of the total came from billionaire entrepreneur Elon Musk's efforts, with Trump's blessing to reduce the federal workforce. Challenger put the total announced federal job cuts at 62,242, spanning 17 agencies. January's planned reductions brought the total through the first 2 months of the year to 221,812, also the highest for the period since 2009, and up 33% from the same time in 2024. Now, notice they're not relying on the federal Labor Department's numbers. They're relying on a private sector. We'll see what the Labor Department says, but isn't it odd, first, of the media relying on this outside report, not waiting for Labor Department data to come in? We'll be able to cross-check the Labor Department when this happens. But also, notice it was not a problem to the Democrats or members of the media or the business community when the private sector was shrinking, but the public sector was growing. When we had good jobs data, but that jobs data was coming from hiring by the federal government, throwing money at people essentially to keep the job numbers up. And in the healthcare industry, as Americans age, you get more people in the healthcare industry, nurses, assistants helping retirees at home, things like that in the healthcare sector. Everybody was fine. They were totally fine with that, even though that's not the sign of a healthy economy. It's not a good thing for the economy when the public sector is growing. If the public sector is growing, the private sector is shrinking. Getting rid of people from the public sector, moving them into the private sector, is actually not a bad thing. Now, this is going to sound cruel and crass to a lot of people. I know that out of the gate, but it needs to be said. I know the hate mail that's coming from saying this, but it needs to be said. We've been told for the past 4 years of the Biden administration that we needed illegal aliens in this country because we didn't have enough people to work in the private sector. We've been told repeatedly by the media, by the Democrats, by the Department of Labor, by the Department of Commerce, by outside business entities on CNBC, that we needed illegal aliens because we didn't have enough federal workforce. We didn't have enough public-private workforce. We didn't have enough workers. We got to have illegal aliens to offset it, not just for the jobs Americans don't want to do for cheap, but for jobs generally. We had to have illegal aliens because there weren't enough Americans in the workforce to be able to cover all the costs and cover all the jobs and do all the things Americans wanted. We needed illegal aliens because we just simply didn't have enough workers, because people were retiring, the workforce was getting old, and people weren't going to go to work. Well, guess what? We now have 227,000 federal workers without a job. Welcome into the public or private workforce. So why do we need the illegal aliens now? I know that comes across as cruel. It's interesting. The CNBC picture has 2 women, one of those carrying one of those white banker's boxes. The caption is, "Recently fired U.S. Agency for International Development staff carry boxes with a message as they leave work and are applauded by former USAID staffers and supporters during a send-off." outside USAID offices in Washington, D.C. What is interesting are the number of people who are out there supporting them, holding up signs, but they're wearing their N95 masks, standing outside. You know, progressives, when you see them these days, they're all wearing their paranoia masks. They're not even COVID masks. They're not even masks to keep them from getting sick. They're paranoia masks. They're either paranoid of you recognizing them, or they're paranoid of disease from their fellow Americans because they don't particularly care for their fellow Americans at this point. But CNBC uses the picture of solidarity with the federal workers who are leaving. Now, listen, I don't celebrate when people lose jobs. I thought it was very cruel when Laura Loomer and others organized protests outside USAID and other agencies to cheer on the loss of these people's jobs and to cheer as these people were walking outside the victims of job losses. I don't think it's good to celebrate someone suffering, even if it's someone I don't like. I'm not going to celebrate particularly even Joy Reid losing her job. I think she deserved to lose her job, but it's not something I'm going to get pom-poms out for and march down the street cheering about, as some people do, because someone lost their job, and it's a human being made in the image of God, and I'm just not going to supremely root against them and cheer on their misery. You know, what could happen to them could happen to me. There, but by the grace of God go I, even if I think she needed to lose her job. Even if I think these people need to lose their job because the federal workforce doesn't need to be this high, it's not something really to celebrate. It's just something to note that it's not a bad thing. These people aren't indispensable. They can lose their jobs. And also, they can now go into the private workforce that we've been supplementing with illegal aliens, and they can take the jobs the illegal aliens were doing, and we can send the illegal aliens home. And these aren't all jobs that Americans won't do for cheap. I mean, if you actually listen to the people talking about it, there are a lot of jobs out there where the American workforce just decided to sit it out. They gave up during COVID. They sat home. They decided to retire. We need people back in the private workforce. Well, guess what? Thanks to Elon Musk, we got a lot of people going to the private workforce now. The Veterans Affairs Administration is saying that they're about to do massive cuts, 70,000 employees. This is from the Wall Street Journal. If you text data to 33777, you can subscribe to the show notes. Get this article for yourself. The Trump administration is aiming to cut tens of thousands of workers from the Department of Veterans Affairs. Veterans Affairs Secretary Doug Collins said the department would conduct a broad review of its organization and operations with a goal of cutting its workforce from about 470,000 to approximately 398,000 people. In a video posted on Twitter, Collins said the cuts wouldn't affect health care or benefits for veterans and beneficiaries, adding the department would still be hiring for mission-critical roles. For many years, veterans have been asking for a more efficient, accountable, and transparent VA. This administration is finally going to give the veterans what they want. Veterans Affairs is one of the many departments the Trump administration has targeted for cuts. The VA cuts are slated to occur in August. Last month, the agency said more than 1,400 employees were terminated because they were on probation, a designation for workers often in their first year or two in a new role. In January, the agency said it had fired several dozen employees working on DEI issues. Veterans Affairs needs reform. They do have to be careful, however. They want to make sure they're not cutting doctors and nurses at VA hospitals or cutting the people who make it easy to process scheduling at VA hospitals, but I bet you there are lots of bureaucrats who can be fired. VA is also problematic in that a lot of people who work in the VA are veterans. You want to be careful for the sob stories on the media, for the PR damage that can happen. You also don't want to be celebrating the losses because then you come across as cruel. The Democrats are coming across as crazy right now. Remember, the Republicans were coming across as crazy a while back, and the Democrats were cruel, and the voting public said, we'll go with crazy. We don't like cruel. Now, if the Republicans become cruel and the Democrats crazy, guess what? The public can go back and say, yeah, well, we still don't like cruel. We've gone with a different brand of crazy. You got to be careful. But also, if we're honest about it, these jobs are not indispensable. The media doesn't celebrate the people in the private sector who are losing their jobs. You know, there were job cuts at ABC News yesterday. 300 some odd people at ABC News out of jobs. don't like it when people lose jobs, but this is what happens in the private sector. Even those people, the people from Joanne Fabric, the people from ABC News, they're not going to get fawning portrayals on television unless there's someone real famous in the news media. The media always heralds the famous people in the media who lose their jobs. But they'll put on the veteran who loses his job at the VA, who insists that his job is indispensable. There was a progressive partisan activist, used to be a teacher in DeKalb County, Georgia. I was actually tipped off by one of his former students. He moved on eventually to work for the FAA, was working on a project to do missile detection for the FAA, and insisted his job was critical and vital and necessary, and he lost his job, and Americans were going to be at risk because he lost his job. Everyone has a high-minded view of their own job. Everyone believes themselves indispensable, with very few exceptions. And I understand that. But just because you view yourself as indispensable doesn't mean you actually are. And the treatment that the media is giving to fired federal employees that they would never give to anyone else, they're only doing it to attack Donald Trump, is in and of itself a partisan spectacle. Yep, there were job losses in February. Maybe that'll mean interest rates come down because the Fed will think we got to stimulate the economy. Maybe so. It's not a bad thing. Not a bad thing necessarily. What is a bad thing, in my mind, is the hagiographic treatment of the federal workers, that they're all saints. Saints unable to lose their jobs. Saints who must be treated with kid gloves. Saints but for whom the world would go to hell. Nobody else gets that treatment. Here's the one thing, though, you can take from all of this. Elon Musk is having a real-world impact on the federal government. It's not just the contracts being canceled. It's not just the money being saved by the cancellation of those contracts. He's putting federal employees out, and he's moved so quickly, he's moved so rapidly that it's actually beginning to show up in the labor data. It's showing up in the private sector data. It's actually meaningful rate of return on saving money for the federal government, because each of those jobs, those 270,000 jobs that are out, however unfortunate it may be, that's money saved by the federal government. Money that can go to savings for the American people. Money that can go to pay down the national debt. So as an individual who doesn't cheer on when people lose jobs, I, as a taxpayer, can at least be reassured that Musk has found ways to save me money. It could all blow up in their face. They could have fired the wrong people. In fact, they fired some they didn't mean to and had to rehire them. But a lot of it, I mean, yeah, it sounds cruel to say, I get it. But also, is there no job in the federal government that can be let go? Because that seems to be the tenor and tone of the conversation of the left, is that everyone is necessary. Everyone is indispensable. Everyone in the federal government is, and I just don't believe that's the case.